The iron shackles lay folded with impossible precision on the granite steps of St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, their surface slick with morning dew. No lock had been broken, no link severed, yet they rested there as deliberately as a folded napkin on a dinner table. The white congregation arriving for morning prayers stopped in their tracks, their faces draining of color as they followed the single set of bare footprints leading from the church door across the dirt road and disappearing into the dense Virginia forest. Isaiah Lewis, who had been chained and guarded inside that very church the night before, had vanished like smoke, and the mystery of how he escaped those impossible bonds would haunt Henrico County for generations to come. Before we carry on, Sorrel, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Isaiah Lewis begins not with his disappearance, but 3 months earlier in the sweltering heat of August 1844. The tobacco fields of the Whitmore plantation stretched for hundreds of acres across the rolling hills of Virginia, their broad leaves casting insufficient shade for the dozens of enslaved workers who toiled beneath the merciless sun. Isaiah moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, his dark hands checking each plant for hornworms, his mind somewhere far beyond the boundaries of the land that held him captive. He was 28 years old that summer, though he looked older, his face weathered by exposure and hardship into something that might have belonged to a man of 40. His body was lean and muscular from years of field work, his shoulders broad, his hands calloused and strong. But it was his eyes that set him apart from the other enslaved people on the plantation. They held a quality that made overseers uncomfortable, a kind of quiet intensity that suggested thoughts running deeper than the shallow channels they expected from those they considered property. Isaiah had been born into slavery on a smaller farm in nearby Chesterfield County, the son of a woman named Dinah, who had died when he was barely 5 years old. His memories of her were fragmentary, impressionistic, just the warmth of her embrace and the sound of her voice humming melodies that seemed to come from some distant ancestral memory. After her death, he had been sold twice before landing at the Whitmore estate at the age of 12. Small for his age, but already showing the quiet determination that would define his character. The master of Whitmore Plantation was Cornelius Whitmore, a man of 53 years who considered himself a benevolent slaveholder, a distinction he wore like a badge of honor at social gatherings in Richmond. He allowed his enslaved workers to marry, to keep small garden plots, to attend church services on Sunday mornings. He rarely used the whip himself, preferring to leave such distasteful tasks to his overseer, a brutal man named Jessup Carn, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the infliction of pain. Cornelius Whitmore told himself that this delegation made him enlightened, that the suffering happening under his authority was somehow separate from his own character because he did not personally wield the instrument of torment. Isaiah had learned early that survival meant keeping his thoughts hidden, his face a mask of placid obedience that revealed nothing of the calculations happening behind his eyes. He had watched others broken for showing defiance, had seen men and women destroyed for the simple crime of asserting their humanity. So he became expert at the performance of servitude, saying yes, master, and no, master with perfect timing, lowering his eyes at precisely the right moments, laughing at the overseer's crude jokes when laughter was expected. But inside, in the private spaces of his mind, Isaiah was free. He collected stories the way other men collected coins, listening to the whispered tales that passed between enslaved people in the quarters after dark. Stories of those who had escaped, who had followed the drinking gourd north to places where a man or woman might walk without chains. Stories of the underground network of safe houses and sympathetic souls who helped runaways on their desperate journey. Stories of freedom that seemed as distant and impossible as the stars themselves, yet somehow more real than the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that defined his days. In the fall of that year, Cornelius Whitmore made a decision that would set in motion the chain of events leading to Isaiah's impossible escape. The master had been losing money for several years, his expenses exceeding his profits, his debts mounting to uncomfortable levels. He had borrowed heavily from banks in Richmond to expand his holdings on, and now those loans were coming due with interest rates that threatened to consume what remained of his fortune. His solution, like that of so many plantation owners facing financial difficulties, was to sell some of his human property to cover his obligations. Isaiah learned of this plan on a cool October evening when he overheard the overseer discussing it with one of the field hands who served as an informant, trading scraps of information for extra rations. 12 people were to be sold at auction in Richmond the following month, separated from whatever families they had managed to build, sent to places unknown to work for masters whose temperaments could range from indifferent to sadistic. Isaiah's name was on that list. The knowledge settled into his stomach like a stone in deep water. He had no wife, no children, having deliberately avoided attachments that might be used to control him or torn away to cause him pain. But he had friends in the quarters, people he cared about, a community that had become the closest thing to a family he had known since his mother's death. More than that, he had his garden plot, his small collection of belongings, the familiar rhythms of a life that, while not free, was at least known. To be sold meant to lose even these small anchors, to be cast adrift into uncertainty. That night, lying on his thin mattress in the cramped cabin he shared with 5 other men, Isaiah made his decision. He would run. The odds were against him, he knew that. The penalties for attempting escape were severe, ranging from brutal whipping to mutilation to death. Dogs would be set on his trail. Slave catchers with their networks of informants would be hunting him. The journey north was hundreds of miles through hostile territory with few resources and fewer allies. But the alternative, to be sold and resold like livestock, to live out his days without even the ghost of autonomy, was no longer acceptable. Planning an escape required patience and cunning. Isaiah began his preparations with the care of a chess player thinking several moves ahead. He started hoarding food, taking slightly smaller portions at meals and hiding bits of cornbread and dried meat in a hollow tree at the edge of the tobacco fields. He fashioned a crude pack from an old burlap sack, waterproofing it with rendered fat. He listened more carefully than ever to the stories of successful escapes, trying to extract useful information from narratives that were often more legend than fact. In early November, opportunity presented itself in an unexpected form. Cornelius Whitmore announced that he would be attending a church gathering in Richmond on the second Sunday of the month. An all-day affair involving services, a meal, and extended socializing with other members of Virginia's planter aristocracy. As was his custom when making such trips, he would take several of his enslaved workers with him to serve food, tend horses, and generally attend to the needs of the white guests. Isaiah was selected as part of this group, chosen perhaps because of his reputation for reliability, or perhaps by simple chance. The journey to Richmond took most of Saturday, the 6th of November. Isaiah rode in a wagon with 3 other enslaved people, their wrists shackled together, watching the countryside roll past with eyes that recorded every detail. He noted the position of the sun, the direction they traveled, landmarks that might serve as waypoints if he needed to retrace this route. The city of Richmond sat on the James River, a sprawling collection of buildings ranging from elegant townhouses to rough warehouses, its streets busy with commerce and humanity in all its varieties. They arrived at the Pendleton estate in the late afternoon, a grand house on the western edge of the city surrounded by carefully manicured gardens that seemed designed to demonstrate the owner's wealth and taste. Isaiah and the others were immediately put to work preparing for the next day's gathering, hauling supplies, setting up tables, performing the countless tasks required to create an appearance of effortless hospitality. That evening, as darkness settled over Richmond, Isaiah was locked with the other enslaved workers in a storage building adjacent to the main house. But Cornelius Whitmore had one additional instruction for his overseer, who had accompanied them on the trip. Isaiah was to be secured with extra precautions, fitted with leg irons in addition to the standard restraints, because whispers had reached the master's ears suggesting that his normally compliant worker might be contemplating something foolish. The leg irons were old, heavy things, their metal stained with rust and the sweat of previous wearers. Jessup Karn fastened them around Isaiah's ankles with obvious satisfaction, cinching them tight enough to bite into the flesh, checking the locks twice to ensure they held firm. Then, as an additional measure, he attached a length of chain connecting Isaiah's wrist shackles to his leg irons, effectively hobbling him in a position that made even basic movement difficult and painful. "Heard you been asking too many questions about the auction," Karn said, his voice low and threatening as he secured the final lock. "Heard you been thinking thoughts above your station. You try anything at all, and I'll see you whipped until you can't stand. You understand me, boy?" Isaiah kept his eyes down, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, sir, Mr. Karn. I ain't gonna cause no trouble. Just want to serve the master well and get back home." Karn studied him for a long moment, looking for signs of deception, then nodded and left, taking the lantern with him and plunging the storage room into darkness. Isaiah heard the sound of a heavy bar being dropped into place on the outside of the door, the final barrier between him and any hope of freedom. He sat in that darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of the chains, the bite of the metal against his skin. Around him, he could hear the breathing of the other enslaved workers, some already asleep despite their circumstances, others lying awake with their own thoughts and fears. Outside, through the small gaps in the walls, he could hear the sounds of the city, voices and horses and the distant bark of dogs. The impossibility of his situation settled over him like a blanket. Even if he could somehow get out of this locked room, he was shackled hand and foot with chains that would take a blacksmith's tools to remove. He had no key, no file, no leverage that might break the locks or links. And even if by some miracle he escaped these bonds, he was in the middle of Richmond, surrounded by thousands of people who would see a black man without his master and immediately raise the alarm. The city had night patrols specifically to catch runaways, armed men who knew every trick and hiding place. Yet Isaiah found himself thinking not of the obstacles but of the stories he had heard over the years. Stories of Harriet Tubman, the woman they called Moses, who had escaped slavery and returned again and again to lead others to freedom. Stories of Frederick Douglass, who had boarded a train with borrowed papers and ridden to liberty. Stories of countless nameless men and women who had slipped away in the night, following the North Star through swamps and forests, surviving on faith and determination, and the kindness of strangers who risked their own safety to offer help. In every story there had been a moment when escape seemed impossible, when the odds were so stacked against success that any rational person would have given up. But the people in those stories had not been rational. They had been desperate, driven by a hunger for freedom so profound that it overrode every other consideration, including personal safety. They had taken absurd risks, made impossible leaps of faith, trusted in providence or luck or divine intervention because the alternative was to accept their chains forever. Isaiah closed his eyes and thought of his mother, trying to remember the sound of her humming. He thought of the endless rows of tobacco plants, the ache in his back at day's end, the taste of fear every time Jessup Karn approached with his whip coiled at his belt. He thought of the auction block in Richmond where he would be sold in a few weeks, displayed like livestock, prodded and examined by potential buyers evaluating his worth in dollars and cents. He thought of all the years stretching ahead of him, Decades of servitude with no hope of change, working until his body gave out and he died in the fields or in some cramped cabin, unmourned except by whatever friends remained alive to remember him. The decision crystallized in that moment with absolute clarity. He would escape tonight from this locked room, from these chains, from this city. The how of it remained mysterious, gone, perhaps impossible, but the intention became as solid and real as the metal binding his limbs. He would be free or he would be dead, but he would not willingly remain a slave. Isaiah spent the hours until midnight in a state of focused meditation, his breathing slow and deliberate, his mind emptying itself of fear and doubt. He had heard stories from an old man who had been captured in Africa as a young man, tales of practices that allowed warriors to endure impossible pain, to push their bodies beyond normal human limits. The old man had called it different names in his native tongue, but the essence was the same, a kind of communion between mind and flesh that let a person transcend ordinary boundaries. Whether such things were real or simply legend, Isaiah found that the practice of deep breathing and mental focus brought him to a state of unusual calm. The pain of the shackles faded into background noise. The fear that had been tightening his chest loosened its grip. He felt himself becoming very still inside, as if some core part of his being had retreated to a quiet place beyond the reach of chains or masters. Around midnight, he heard movement outside the storage room, footsteps approaching, then pausing near the door. For a moment he tensed, wondering if Jessup Karn had returned to check on him or deliver some additional torment. But the footsteps moved on, and he realized it was just one of the house servants making late rounds. Isaiah waited another hour, until the sounds of the city had quieted to almost nothing, until even the other enslaved workers in the room with him had fallen into deep sleep. Then he began to move, slowly and carefully, testing the limits of his bonds. The chains connecting his wrists to his ankles meant he could not stand upright or even crawl in any normal fashion. But he found that by rolling onto his side and drawing his knees up toward his chest, he could inch along the floor like a wounded caterpillar. The movement was agonizing, each shift of position causing the metal to dig deeper into his flesh, but he persisted, moving inch by painful inch toward the wall of the storage room. What he was looking for, what he hoped existed, was a weakness in the building's construction. The structure was old, its wood weathered by years of Virginia weather, and Isaiah had noticed earlier in the day that some of the boards near the floor seemed warped and loose. If he could find a gap wide enough, if he could somehow squeeze through despite his chains, he might be able to get outside without having to deal with the barred door. It took him nearly an hour to traverse the 20 feet to the wall, his progress maddeningly slow, his body bathed in sweat despite the November chill. When he finally reached the boards he had noted earlier, he ran his shackled hands along them, feeling for gaps and weaknesses. There, near the corner where two walls met, he found what he was searching for. Several boards that shifted when he pushed against them, their nails rusted and loose. Working as quietly as possible, Isaiah began to push and pull at the boards, trying to widen the gap between them. The metal of his chains scraped against the wood, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night, but none of the other workers stirred. After perhaps 20 minutes of effort, he managed to pull one board completely free, then another, creating an opening about 18 inches wide. Now came the truly difficult part. The opening was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through under normal circumstances, and Isaiah was anything but unencumbered. His chains meant he could not extend his body straight or use his limbs independently. He would have to thread himself through that narrow gap while shackled hand and foot, a feat that seemed to defy basic physics. He began with his arms, pushing his shackled wrists through the opening first, feeling the night air cold against his skin. Then his head and shoulders. turning his body at an awkward angle to fit through the space. The board scraped against his skin, drawing blood, but he barely noticed. His entire being focused on the single goal of getting through that opening. His chest and torso followed, the chains on his legs scraping against the wood with sounds that seemed certain to wake someone. He paused, listening, but heard nothing except the pounding of his own heart. Then he continued, pulling his hips through, then his legs, until finally he lay on the cold ground outside the storage building, free of its confines, even if not free of his chains. Isaiah allowed himself 30 seconds to rest, to let his breathing slow, to assess his situation. He was outside, that was progress, but he was still shackled, still on the Pendleton estate, still in the middle of a city full of people who would instantly recognize an escaped slave if they saw him. He needed to find a way to remove these chains, and he needed to do it quickly before someone discovered his absence. He began crawling away from the storage building, his progress still hampered by the chains connecting his wrists and ankles. The estate grounds were dark, the main house a looming shadow perhaps 200 feet away. He could see lights in some of the windows, suggesting that some of the white folks were still awake, talking and drinking and enjoying their privilege while people like Isaiah suffered in chains. Near the back of the property, Isaiah knew, was a small workshop where the estate's blacksmith plied his trade. If he could get there, if he could find the right tools, he might be able to break his bonds. It was a desperate plan with 1,000 ways to fail, but it was the only option he could imagine. The journey to the workshop took nearly half an hour, each movement carefully calculated to avoid making noise, each pause to rest bringing the risk of discovery closer. But finally he reached the small wooden structure, its door secured with a simple latch rather than a lock. Using his teeth and his limited hand mobility, he managed to work the latch open and slip inside. The workshop was pitch black, forcing Isaiah to work entirely by touch. He ran his hands along the workbench until he found what he needed, a heavy chisel and a hammer. Then came the truly risky part. He would need to strike the chisel against the weakest points of his shackles, and the sound of metal striking metal would carry in the quiet night. Isaiah positioned the chisel against the hinge pin of one of his leg irons, then raised the hammer. He hesitated for just a moment, knowing that this action would irrevocably commit him to his course. There would be no explanation for why he had tried to break his chains except the truth that he was attempting to escape. If he failed now, the punishment would be severe beyond imagination. He brought the hammer down. The impact sent a shock through his hands and a sharp metallic ring through the air. He froze, listening, but heard no responding sounds of alarm. He struck again and again, and on the fourth blow the hinge pin shifted, loosening its grip on the metal. 3 more strikes and it fell free, allowing him to open the shackle and remove it from his ankle. Working with the same method, Isaiah managed to free his other leg, then turned his attention to his wrist shackles. These proved more difficult, their construction more robust, their locks more complex. But desperation lent him strength and ingenuity. He wedged the chisel into the space between the cuff and the locking mechanism, then levered it with all his strength. Something in the lock gave way with a snap that seemed as loud as a gunshot. But still no alarm was raised, no voices shouting in the darkness. 20 minutes later, Isaiah stood free of all his chains for the first time in days. He left them on the workbench, then paused, seized by an impulse he could not fully explain. Instead of simply abandoning the shackles in random positions, he found himself carefully folding the chains, arranging them in neat alignment, creating a strange kind of order from the instruments of his bondage. The action took only a moment, but it felt important somehow. A deliberate act rather than a panicked flight, a statement that his escape was a choice rather than mere animal desperation. Isaiah slipped out of the workshop and began making his way toward the edge of the estate, moving now with the fluid speed of an unencumbered man. He knew he had to get out of Richmond quickly before dawn brought discovery of his escape. But where could he go? The open roads would be full of patrols, especially once the alarm was raised. The river was patrolled by boats watching for runaways trying to use the water as an escape route. Then he remembered something he had heard years ago, a fragment of conversation between two enslaved workers who had been hired out to work in the city. They had mentioned a church, St. Mark's Presbyterian, where the minister was rumored to have sympathies toward the abolitionist cause. More importantly, they had said that the church had a cellar that connected to a network of old tunnels dating back to Richmond's earliest days, passages that had once been used for storage and smuggling. It was a thin lead, possibly nothing more than rumor, but Isaiah had no better options. He oriented himself using the stars, finding north and then estimating where the church district would be relative to the Pendleton estate. Then he began to run, keeping to shadows and alleys, his bare feet silent on the dirt streets. Richmond at night was not completely empty. He passed drunkards stumbling from taverns, saw watchmen with their lanterns on distant corners, heard dogs barking at his passage. Each encounter sent his heart racing, certain that someone would challenge him, demand to know his business, see in his face the truth of what he was. But whether by skill or luck or divine providence, he made it through the streets unaccosted. St. Mark's Presbyterian Church stood on a corner lot, its white paint ghostly in the starlight, its steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation. Isaiah circled the building once, looking for entry points, and found a small door at the back that yielded to pressure, its lock old and weak. He slipped inside, finding himself in a storage room filled with dusty hymnals and church supplies. The interior of the church was utterly dark, forcing Isaiah to feel his way forward with his hands. He found stairs leading down, descended into a cellar that smelled of earth and mildew. Using his hands to explore the space, he discovered that the cellar was larger than he had expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the building above. And there, in the far corner behind a stack of old barrels, he found what he was looking for, an opening in the wall partially concealed by debris. Isaiah cleared the debris and found himself looking into a tunnel, its walls brick, its construction obviously old. He had no idea where it led, but staying in the church seemed more dangerous than exploring the unknown. He entered the tunnel and began to crawl. The passage was narrow and low, forcing him to move on his hands and knees through darkness so complete it seemed solid. He lost all sense of time and direction, knowing only that he was moving forward, away from the church, away from the city, away from slavery. His hands encountered mud and slime. His knees scraped against rough brick, but he continued without pause. After what might have been an hour or might have been 3, Isaiah saw a faint lessening of the darkness ahead. He moved toward it and found that the tunnel ended at a grate opening into a drainage ditch at the outskirts of the city. The grate was rusted and gave way with minimal effort, allowing him to climb out into the open air. He emerged in a wooded area just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Behind him, Richmond sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, unaware that a man had just walked out of its midst like a ghost passing through walls. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, but also the possibility of freedom. Isaiah allowed himself one look back at the city, then turned north and began to run. He ran through the woods, following deer trails and streams, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the inevitable pursuit that would come when his absence was discovered. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, and then he kept running. The sun was well up when he finally allowed himself to stop, collapsing in a hollow beneath a fallen oak tree, his body screaming for rest. He lay there gasping, hardly able to believe what he had accomplished. Against all odds, despite chains and locks and guards, he had escaped. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but in this moment he was free, and that simple fact seemed more miraculous than anything he had ever experienced. What Isaiah did not know, could not know as he lay hidden in that forest, was that his escape would become something more than just another runaway story. When Jessup Karn discovered his absence later that morning, when he found the empty storage room and the boards pulled loose, he immediately went to the workshop to see if Isaiah had tried to break his bonds there. What he found instead were the chains, all 4 shackles lying on the workbench in perfect alignment, folded with impossible precision for objects of their shape and design. Confused and angry, Karn gathered the chains and took them back to show Cornelius Whitmore, who had just finished breakfast when the overseer burst in with his strange report. The 2 men examined the shackles, finding the damage Isaiah had done with the chisel and hammer, but still unable to explain the peculiar way they had been arranged. It looked less like the frantic work of an escaping slave and more like a deliberate artistic arrangement, each piece positioned with care. "He mocking us," Karn said, his face red with anger. "Left them like this to show he ain't afraid, like he wanted us to know he did this on purpose." Whitmore said nothing, turning the chains over in his hands, disturbed in ways he could not articulate. There was something unsettling about those neatly folded shackles, something that spoke to a mind more organized and deliberate than he had credited any of his enslaved workers with possessing. It suggested planning, intelligence, a capacity for complex thought that contradicted everything he told himself about the nature of the people he owned. But the mystery deepened further when one of the house servants, sent to check on the church where the gathering had been held the night before, returned with an even stranger report. The servant had found another set of chains, this time leg irons and wrist shackles that no one had seen Isaiah remove, arranged with the same impossible neatness on the front steps of St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. They sat there as if placed by careful hands, their metal surface covered with morning dew, a testament to a presence that no one had witnessed. The minister of St. Mark's, Reverend Josiah Palmer, was called to examine the scene. He was a thin man in his 60s, his hair white, his face marked with the lines of someone who spent much time in contemplation. He looked at the folded chains for a long time without speaking, then knelt on the steps and touched them gently, as if they were holy relics rather than instruments of bondage. "There are mysteries in this world," he said finally, his voice soft, "that reason cannot fully explain. Perhaps this young man had help. Perhaps he had simply the determination that comes from a soul that will not accept bondage. But these chains, arranged thus, they seem to speak of something more, do they not? They speak of a person asserting dignity in the very act of casting off his chains. They speak of deliberation rather than desperation, of choice rather than panic." Cornelius Whitmore, who had come to the church with his overseer, bristled at these words. "You speak as if this is something admirable, Reverend. The man is a thief. He stole himself from me. He is my property under the law." Palmer looked at the plantation owner with eyes that held no judgment but also no agreement. "I speak only of what I see, Mr. Whitmore. These chains tell a story, whether we wish to hear it or not." News of the escaped slave and his mysteriously folded chains spread through Richmond with remarkable speed. By afternoon, the story had taken on embellishments and additions, growing in the telling the way such stories do. Some said Isaiah had been seen walking through locked doors. Others claimed he had flown over the city walls like a bird. A few whispered that he had been aided by angels or by conjure magic, that no mere human could have escaped such secure bonds. Slave catchers were hired, dogs were brought in, and a reward of $300 was posted for Isaiah's capture. But the trail went cold at the drainage ditch where he had emerged from the tunnel. The dog circled in confusion, unable to pick up a scent that led in any consistent direction. It was as if Isaiah had simply vanished from the earth after climbing out of that tunnel. In reality, Isaiah was running north with the single-minded determination of a man who knew that capture meant death. He traveled by night, following the North Star, hiding during the day in whatever cover he could find. He ate what he could forage or steal, drank from streams, pushed his body to limits he had not known existed. He was helped along the way by the network of people, both black and white, who risked their own safety to assist runaways. In a barn outside of Fredericksburg, an elderly Quaker woman gave him food and shoes, asking no questions, simply pointing him toward the next safe house on the route. In Maryland, he hid for 3 days in the basement of a free black family while slave catchers searched the area. In Pennsylvania, still not quite believing he had crossed that invisible line into free territory, he worked for a week on a farm whose owner asked only his first name and paid him in cash for his labor. Isaiah kept moving north, through Pennsylvania, into New York, and finally across the border into Canada in the bitter cold of late December. When he finally reached Toronto and realized that he was truly free, that no one could legally drag him back into slavery, he sat down on a street corner and wept, great racking sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, releasing years of accumulated grief and fear and rage. He found work in Toronto, building a life slowly, one day at a time. He married a woman named Grace who had also escaped slavery, and together they had 4 children who would never know chains or masters. He learned to read and write, attended church on Sundays, became a respected member of the small community of former slaves who had made Toronto their home. But Isaiah never forgot those chains, never forgot the moment when he had stood in that workshop, free of his bonds for the first time, compelled by some instinct he still did not fully understand to fold them neatly before leaving. He told the story to his children and grandchildren, trying to explain what he had felt in that moment. The need to assert his humanity through that small act of deliberation. "I wanted them to know," he would say, his voice still carrying the cadences of Virginia despite decades in Canada, "that I was not a beast fleeing in panic. I wanted them to understand that I was a man making a choice, taking back what was stolen from me. Those folded chains were my signature, my declaration that I had the right to decide my own fate." The story of the folded chains lived on long after Isaiah's death in 1892 at the age of 76. It was told and retold in the communities of escaped slaves, becoming part of the oral tradition of resistance and resilience. Some versions of the story emphasize the impossible nature of the escape, the miraculous quality of a man walking through locked doors and sealed chains. Other versions focused on the practical details, the chisel and hammer, the old tunnel, the network of helpers along the way. But all versions agreed on the central image that gave the story its power. Those chains folded with impossible neatness on the church steps, damp with morning dew, a silent testament to one man's refusal to accept bondage. They became a symbol, those chains, representing not just Isaiah's escape, but the possibility of escape for all enslaved people. The hope that freedom was not just a distant dream, but an achievable reality for those brave or desperate or determined enough to reach for it. In Virginia, the story took on a different cast. Among the enslaved population, Isaiah became a legend, a figure of hope and inspiration. Parents told their children about him in whispered voices, careful not to be overheard by masters or overseers who might punish them for spreading such dangerous ideas. The story was passed down through generations, surviving slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction, becoming part of the hidden history of resistance that sustained black communities through centuries of oppression. Among the white population, the story was more complicated. Some dismissed it entirely, calling it a fabrication or an exaggeration, refusing to believe that an enslaved person could show such intelligence and planning. Others were troubled by it, finding in those folded chains a challenge to the narratives they told themselves about slavery and race and human nature. If Isaiah could plan and execute such an escape, if he could think and reason and act with such deliberation, then what did that say about the institution that claimed such people were incapable of self-governance? Cornelius Whitmore never spoke publicly about Isaiah's escape after the initial search was abandoned. But those who knew him said he was changed by it, that he became quieter and more introspective, less certain of the righteousness of his position. He sold several enslaved people before the scheduled auction, but then canceled the sale of the rest, claiming financial circumstances had changed. Some said he had been shaken by the escape, by the image of those folded chains that seemed to accuse him every time he closed his eyes. Jessup Carn, the overseer, had no such crisis of conscience. He became, if anything, more brutal after Isaiah's escape, as if he could punish other enslaved people for the crime of one man's successful flight. But his cruelty eventually caught up with him. In 1848, he was found dead in the tobacco fields, killed by person or persons unknown. No one was ever charged with the crime, and no one among the enslaved population seemed particularly troubled by his demise. Reverend Josiah Palmer, the minister of St. Mark's Presbyterian, became increasingly outspoken in his opposition to slavery after finding those chains on his church steps. He began preaching sermons that questioned the morality of the institution, that suggested human bondage was incompatible with Christian principles. His congregation, made up largely of slaveholders and those who profited from the slave economy, did not appreciate this evolution in his thinking. In 1850, he was asked to resign his position. He moved north to Massachusetts, where he became active in the abolitionist movement, speaking at gatherings and writing pamphlets that called for the immediate end of slavery. In his writings, Palmer often referenced the story of Isaiah and the folded chains, using them as a metaphor for the dignity and humanity of enslaved people. Those chains were not simply cast aside in haste, he wrote in one pamphlet. They were folded with care, arranged with precision, left as a message for those who claimed ownership of another soul. In that simple act, that moment of deliberation, Isaiah Lewis demonstrated that he possessed all the qualities we claim make us human: reason, choice, the capacity for symbolic thought and action. If we can see this truth, if we can acknowledge what those folded chains tell us, then we must also acknowledge the moral horror of slavery itself. As the years passed and the nation moved inexorably toward the Civil War, Isaiah's story became part of the larger narrative of resistance that helped fuel the abolitionist cause. Frederick Douglass mentioned it in a speech in 1857, using it as an example of the intelligence and capability of enslaved people. Harriet Tubman heard the story from escaped slaves she guided north on the Underground Railroad, and she in turn passed it along to others, adding it to the store of tales that inspired people to risk everything for freedom. The Civil War came, and with it the slow and costly destruction of the institution of slavery. When Union forces occupied Richmond in April 1865, some of the soldiers quartered at the Pendleton estate heard stories from the former slaves there about a man named Isaiah, who had escaped 20 years earlier, leaving his chains folded in impossible places. The soldiers were skeptical at first, but the formerly enslaved people insisted it was true, that their parents and grandparents had been there, had seen the chains, had heard the white folks talking about it in confusion and anger. One of these soldiers, a young corporal from Massachusetts named Andrew Finch, was sufficiently intrigued by the story to investigate further. He visited St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, which had been damaged during the war but was still standing. He spoke with people who remembered Reverend Palmer and the strange morning when chains had been found on the church steps. He even tracked down Cornelius Whitmore, now an old man whose plantation had been destroyed by the war, whose fortune had evaporated, who was living in a modest house in Richmond on the charity of relatives. Finch found Whitmore willing to talk, perhaps because the world that had given his life meaning had been destroyed, and he had nothing left to protect. The old man confirmed the basic facts of Isaiah's escape: the locked storage room, the chains that had been broken in the workshop, and then, impossibly, the leg irons found folded on the church steps. "I thought I understood the world," Whitmore told Finch, his voice quiet, his eyes distant. "I thought I knew what was right and proper, what God intended. Those chains, they showed me I was wrong, not in some abstract theological sense, but in a concrete, undeniable way. That man Isaiah, he had a mind as keen as any white man's. He planned, he executed, he succeeded in the face of impossible odds. And he left those chains as a message, though I was too proud to hear it then. He was saying, I am human, I am worthy, I have the right to choose my own path. And he was right. God help me, he was right all along." Finch wrote down Whitmore's words and sent them north to be published in a Boston newspaper, adding his own account of investigating the story. The article sparked renewed interest in Isaiah's escape, and efforts were made to find him, to learn what had become of him in the years since his flight from Virginia. But Isaiah Lewis was a common enough name, and the man himself had long ago decided to leave his past behind, to live his life in Canada without constantly looking over his shoulder. It was not until 1890, 2 years before Isaiah's death, that a reporter from Toronto finally connected the elderly Isaiah Lewis living quietly in that city with the legendary runaway from Virginia. The reporter approached Isaiah with caution, unsure if he would be willing to speak about events that were almost 50 years in the past. But Isaiah, now 74 years old, his hair white, his body bent with age but his mind still sharp, agreed to tell his story one final time. The interview was published in newspapers across North America, giving people their first direct account from Isaiah himself. He spoke matter-of-factly about his escape, neither minimizing the difficulties nor exaggerating his achievements. When asked about the folded chains, he paused for a long moment before answering. "I have been asked about those chains hundreds of times," he said, his voice still carrying traces of Virginia accent. "People want to know how I did it, whether I had help from spirits or magic or divine intervention. The truth is simpler and perhaps more profound. I folded those chains because I needed to assert my humanity in that moment. I was not an animal fleeing a trap. I was a man making a choice, and that choice deserved to be marked with intention and care. The folding took perhaps 1 minute, maybe less, but that minute declared to the world and to myself that I was in control of my actions, that I had not simply broken free by accident or good fortune, but that I had planned and executed my escape with deliberation." Isaiah paused, then continued, his words coming slowly as if he was still working out their meaning after all these years. "People ask if I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. Fear was my constant companion for months after I escaped, every sound potentially a slave catcher, every stranger potentially someone who would turn me in for reward money. But fear did not control my actions. I controlled my actions, and that made all the difference. Those folded chains were proof of that control. Evidence that even in the most desperate circumstances, a person can choose how to respond, can assert their dignity through deliberate action." When asked about his life in Canada, Isaiah spoke warmly of his family, his work, the community he had built over decades of freedom. He spoke of watching his children grow up without chains, of seeing his grandchildren learn to read and write, of the simple pleasures of a life lived on his own terms. But he also spoke of the pain of separation, of friends and loved ones left behind in Virginia, of the countless people still suffering under slavery even after the war was supposed to have ended it. "Freedom is not just the absence of chains," he said. It is the presence of opportunity, of dignity, of the right to shape one's own life. I have had that freedom for almost 50 years now, and I am grateful for every day of it. But I think often of those I left behind, of all those who did not make it to freedom, who died in bondage. Their stories deserve to be told too, not just mine. I am just one man who got lucky, who had help along the way, who happened to survive when so many others did not. Isaiah Lewis died on the 3rd of March, 1892, surrounded by his family, free to the end. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both black and white, who had heard his story and been inspired by it. His children made sure that his tale would not be forgotten, passing it down to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the image of those folded chains would continue to resonate through generations. In the years that followed, historians and researchers tried to verify the details of Isaiah's escape, to separate fact from legend. They found documentation of his sale being scheduled, of the church gathering in Richmond on that November weekend in 1844, of the reward offered for his capture. They found Cornelius Whitmore's business records showing an enslaved man named Isaiah on his property lists until November 1844, then listed as runaway. They even found in the archives of St. Mark's Presbyterian Church a brief notation in Reverend Palmer's journal about finding chains on the church steps. Though Palmer had been careful not to write anything that might implicate him in helping a runaway. But the most compelling evidence remained the story itself, told and retold with such consistency across so many sources that its essential truth seemed undeniable. The details might vary from telling to telling, but the core remained constant. A man who escaped impossible bonds and left his chains folded as a testament to his humanity and determination. In the early 20th century, scholars of African American history began collecting these stories systematically, recognizing their importance in understanding the reality of slavery and resistance to it. Isaiah's story was included in several books and academic papers analyzed for what it revealed about the psychology of enslaved people, the mechanics of escape, the role of community and networks in facilitating flight to freedom. Some scholars focused on the symbolic aspects of the folded chains, seeing in them a powerful statement about agency and selfhood. Others focused on the practical details, trying to reconstruct exactly how Isaiah had managed to break his bonds and escape from a locked, guarded building. But perhaps the most important legacy of Isaiah's story was its impact on those who heard it in the generations after his death. For African Americans living through the long, dark years of Jim Crow, through segregation and discrimination and violence, the image of those folded chains offered a powerful message of hope and resistance. It said that even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when the world seemed designed to crush you and deny your humanity, it was possible to assert your dignity, to make choices that declared your worth, to escape the bonds that others tried to impose. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Isaiah's story was often invoked by activists and leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned it in a sermon in 1963, using the folded chains as a metaphor for dignified resistance. Isaiah Lewis could have simply fled in panic, King said. But he took the time to fold his chains, to make a statement through that simple act. That is what we must do in our struggle for justice, not simply react in anger or fear, but act with deliberation and dignity, making each choice a statement of our humanity and our right to freedom. The story continued to resonate into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, taught in schools as part of African American history, referenced in books and films about slavery and the Underground Railroad. It became one of those stories that transcended its specific historical context to become a universal statement about human dignity and resistance to oppression. In 2008, a historical marker was placed at the site where St. Mark's Presbyterian Church once stood in Richmond. The church itself had been torn down decades earlier, replaced by modern buildings, but the marker ensured that the story would not be forgotten. It read, "On this site stood St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. On the morning of November 7, 1844, iron shackles were found folded on the church steps left by Isaiah Lewis, an enslaved man who had escaped bondage the night before. His act of leaving his chains thus arranged, rather than simply casting them aside, has become a symbol of resistance and human dignity. Isaiah Lewis reached freedom in Canada and lived there until his death in 1892, a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the unquenchable desire for freedom. The story of Isaiah Lewis and his folded chains endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the struggle for freedom. It tells us that even in the darkest circumstances, when systems of oppression seem overwhelming and escape seems impossible, individuals can find ways to resist, to assert their humanity, to refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose on them. It tells us that freedom is not just a physical state, but a mental and spiritual one, that the first step toward liberation is the internal decision to no longer accept bondage. Isaiah's story also reminds us that history is made not just by famous leaders and major battles, but by countless individual acts of courage and resistance. We know his name and his story, but there were thousands, tens of thousands of others who also escaped slavery, who also made the dangerous journey north, who also risked everything for freedom. Each of them has a story worthy of being told. Each of them made choices that declared their humanity and dignity. Isaiah's folded chains stand in for all of them, a symbol not just of one man's escape, but of the universal human yearning for freedom and self-determination. As we look back across the nearly 2 centuries since that November night in 1844, we can see how Isaiah's story has been shaped and reshaped by the needs and perspectives of each generation that encountered it. To his contemporaries, it was a story of miraculous escape, tinged with elements of the supernatural. To the abolitionists, it was proof of the intelligence and capability of enslaved people, ammunition in their argument against slavery. To later generations living through Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, it was a story of dignified resistance and the power of symbolic action. To us today, it is all of these things and more, a multi-layered narrative that continues to offer new insights and meanings. The folded chains themselves, of course, do not survive. Whether they were eventually discarded as curiosities or melted down for their metal or simply lost to time, we do not know. But in some ways, their physical disappearance is appropriate. What matters is not the actual pieces of iron, but what they represented, the story they told through their impossible arrangement on those church steps. That story lives on, passed down through generations, adapted and retold, but never losing its essential power. The years Isaiah spent in Canada were not without their struggles and challenges, though they were of a fundamentally different character than those he had endured in Virginia. Freedom brought its own complications, its own demands, its own questions about identity and purpose. In Toronto, Isaiah found himself part of a growing community of formerly enslaved people who had made the same desperate journey north, each carrying their own scars and stories. The winter of 1845, his first in Canada, tested Isaiah in ways he had not anticipated. The cold was unlike anything he had experienced in Virginia, a bone-deep chill that seemed to penetrate walls and clothing and flesh itself. He found work where he could, mostly manual labor, loading and unloading ships at the harbor, working construction sites, doing whatever was necessary to earn enough money to rent a small room in a boarding house that catered to black residents. But more challenging than the physical hardships was the psychological adjustment to freedom. For the first months, Isaiah woke each morning with his heart racing, certain that slave catchers were at the door, that his escape had been a dream and he would find himself back in chains. He startled at sudden noises, avoided looking white people in the eye out of habit, struggled to understand that he could walk freely down the street without papers or permission. It was during this difficult transition period that Isaiah met Grace Hendricks, the woman who would become his wife. She was working as a seamstress, having escaped from Maryland 3 years earlier, and she had already made the adjustment to freedom that Isaiah was still struggling to achieve. Grace saw something in him that first day they met at a church social gathering, a quality of quiet strength that had survived his ordeal, a depth of character that spoke of someone who had endured much and emerged intact. Their courtship was slow and careful, two wounded people learning to trust again, learning that intimacy did not have to come with the threat of separation that had haunted relationships under slavery. When they married in the summer of 1846, the ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by friends from the community of formerly enslaved people who understood what it meant to build a family in freedom, to create bonds that could not be arbitrarily severed by the whims of a master. Grace became Isaiah's anchor in those early years, helping him navigate the complexities of life in a society that, while not perfect, at least recognized his fundamental humanity. She taught him to read and write, skills he had been denied under slavery, spending patient hours with him by lamplight as he laboriously formed letters and words. The act of reading opened new worlds to Isaiah, giving him access to newspapers, books, the written arguments about slavery and abolition that were raging across North America. As Isaiah became more literate and more comfortable in his freedom, he began to feel a responsibility to help others who were making the same journey he had made. By 1848, he had become involved with the network of people in Toronto who assisted newly arrived fugitives, providing them with food, shelter, advice about finding work, and establishing themselves in their new home. He drew on his own experience to help others navigate the difficult transition, understanding their fears and uncertainties in ways that those who had been born free could not. It was through this work that Isaiah met many of the legendary figures of the Underground Railroad. In 1851, he had the opportunity to speak with Harriet Tubman when she passed through Toronto after one of her trips south. They talked for hours, comparing experiences, sharing strategies for escape and evasion. Tubman was fascinated by Isaiah's story of the folded chains, seeing in them a powerful symbol that she would later reference when speaking to groups of enslaved people she was preparing to lead north. That act of folding, Tubman told him, her voice intense with conviction. It shows them that freedom starts in the mind, that even when they're still in chains, they can begin to think like free people, to act with intention and purpose. That's what we need to teach them, that freedom is not just a place you run to, it's a state of being you claim for yourself. Isaiah's conversations with Tubman and others involved in the resistance movement deepened his understanding of his own escape and its significance. He began to see that his individual act of liberation was part of a much larger story, a collective struggle for freedom that involved thousands of people across the continent. The folded chains were not just his personal statement, but a symbol that resonated with a broader movement, representing the possibility of dignified resistance even in the face of overwhelming oppression. In 1853, Grace gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Dinah after Isaiah's mother. Holding his newborn daughter for the first time, Isaiah was overwhelmed by a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at her arrival, certainly, but also a profound gratitude that she would never know slavery, never feel the weight of chains, never be sold away from her parents. The simple fact that she was legally his daughter, that no one could take her from him, seemed almost miraculous after a lifetime of living under a system that recognized no familial bonds for enslaved people. As his family grew, Isaiah became increasingly involved in the political and social life of Toronto's Black community. He attended meetings where strategies for combating slavery were discussed, where news from the United States was analyzed and debated. He contributed money when he could spare it to support the Underground Railroad, knowing that each dollar might help save another person from bondage. He spoke at gatherings, telling his story to mixed audiences of Black and white listeners, using the image of the folded chains to illustrate the humanity and capability of enslaved people. But Isaiah never forgot the people he had left behind in Virginia. At night, lying beside Grace while their children slept in the next room, he would think of the men and women still laboring in Cornelius Whitmore's tobacco fields, still subject to Jessup Carn's brutality, still waiting for their own chance at freedom. The guilt of his escape, of having saved himself while leaving others behind, was a weight he carried always, a shadow on even his happiest moments. In 1854, Isaiah received news that fundamentally changed his understanding of his escape and its aftermath. A newly arrived fugitive from Virginia brought word that the Whitmore plantation had been convulsed by a series of escapes in the years following Isaiah's flight. More than 20 enslaved people had run away between 1845 and 1854, an unprecedented number that had nearly bankrupted Cornelius Whitmore and forced him to sell much of his land. The fugitive, a young man named Gabriel who had worked in the fields alongside people who remembered Isaiah, reported that Isaiah's escape had become legendary among the enslaved population of the region. The story of the folded chains had spread from plantation to plantation, growing and evolving, inspiring others to believe that escape was possible, that freedom could be won through courage and planning. Gabriel said that before he ran, he and several others had gone to look at St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, touching the steps where the chains had been found, drawing strength from the knowledge that Isaiah had stood in that spot on his journey to freedom. "Your story gave us hope," Gabriel told Isaiah, his eyes bright with emotion. "When things seemed darkest, when we thought we couldn't endure another day, we would tell each other about the folded chains, about how you got free despite everything they did to keep you bound. That story kept us alive, kept us believing that freedom was possible. And now here I am, free because you showed us it could be done." This revelation struck Isaiah with tremendous force. He had thought of his escape as a solitary act, a personal rebellion that affected only his own life. But Gabriel's words showed him that actions have consequences far beyond what we can see or predict, that a single act of courage can ripple outward through communities and across years, inspiring others to take their own stands against oppression. The folded chains were no longer just his statement, but had become a rallying symbol for dozens or perhaps hundreds of others. Isaiah began to document the stories of escaped slaves who came through Toronto, recognizing that these narratives needed to be preserved, that future generations would need to know what had been endured and overcome. He filled notebook after notebook with accounts of escapes, of families separated and reunited, of the countless small acts of resistance that added up to a movement. His own story was just one thread in this larger tapestry, but he made sure it was recorded accurately, without embellishment, but also without minimizing the significance of what he had accomplished. The approach of the Civil War in the late 1850s brought new urgency to the abolitionist cause. Isaiah attended rallies and meetings where speakers argued passionately about the need to end slavery immediately, to use violence if necessary to break the chains that bound 4 million people in the American South. He understood the anger and frustration that drove such arguments, having felt those emotions himself during his years in bondage. But he also worried about the cost of such a conflict, the suffering it would bring to both black and white populations. When war finally came in 1861, Isaiah watched from Canada with a mixture of hope and dread. He read every newspaper account he could find, following the progress of battles, the shifting fortunes of Union and Confederate forces, the slow evolution of the war from a conflict about preserving the Union to one explicitly about ending slavery. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, Isaiah wept openly, allowing himself to believe for the first time that the institution that had defined his early life might actually be destroyed. After the war ended in 1865, Isaiah faced a decision that many formerly enslaved people in Canada confronted. Should he return to the United States, to the South where he had been born and enslaved, to be part of rebuilding a society without slavery? Or should he remain in Canada, where he had built a life and a family, where he was safe and established? Isaiah chose to stay in Canada, but his reasons were complex and carefully considered. He had children who had been born free, who knew no other home than Toronto, and he was unwilling to uproot them to return to a place that still held so much trauma for him. Moreover, he recognized that the end of legal slavery did not mean the end of racial oppression, that the fight for true equality would be long and difficult. From Canada, he could continue to support that fight without subjecting his family to the dangers and uncertainties of Reconstruction-era South. But Isaiah made sure to maintain connections with people who did return south, who went back to work as teachers and ministers and political organizers in the devastated southern states. He contributed money to schools being established for formerly enslaved people, to churches being rebuilt, to political campaigns of black candidates running for office during the brief period when Reconstruction policies made such things possible. He wrote letters of encouragement and advice, sharing what he had learned about building a life in freedom, about resisting attempts to force formerly enslaved people back into conditions approximating their previous bondage. As Isaiah aged, as his hair turned white and his body bent with the accumulated weight of years, he became a kind of living monument to the struggle against slavery. Young people in Toronto's black community would come to him for stories about the old days, about what slavery had been like, about how he had escaped. He told them everything, holding back nothing, wanting them to understand the full reality of what their parents and grandparents had endured so that they could live in freedom. In 1879, a delegation of historians from a university in Boston came to Toronto specifically to interview Isaiah. They were collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people, recognizing that these first-hand accounts were invaluable historical documents that would be lost forever, once the generation that had experienced slavery passed away. Isaiah spoke with them for several days, providing a detailed account not just of his escape, but of his entire life. From his earliest memories of his mother through his years at the Whitmore plantation to his journey north and his life in Canada. The historians were particularly interested in the folded chains, in Isaiah's state of mind when he had taken those extra moments to arrange them carefully before fleeing. Isaiah tried to explain that the act had been both calculated and instinctive, that in that moment he had been driven by a need to assert his agency, to demonstrate through a symbolic gesture that he was a person capable of deliberate action rather than an animal fleeing in panic. "I knew those chains would be found," Isaiah told them, his voice still strong despite his years. "I knew that someone would see them and wonder how I had gotten free, how I had arranged them so carefully. And I wanted that confusion, wanted them to understand that they were dealing with a mind as capable as their own. I suppose it was a kind of defiance, but also a kind of communication. I was saying through those folded chains that I understood what they represented, that I was consciously rejecting them, that I had the right and the ability to make that choice." One of the historians asked Isaiah if he had any regrets about his escape, any moments when he wished he had done things differently. Isaiah considered the question carefully before answering. his mind ranging back across the decades to that November night in Richmond. "I regret that I could not take others with me," he said finally. "I regret that my freedom came at the cost of leaving people behind who were just as deserving of liberty as I was. I regret the suffering that continued for 20 more years before slavery finally ended. But the escape itself, no, I have no regrets about that. It was the right choice, the only choice that preserved my humanity. If I had stayed, if I had accepted my fate and gone to that auction block, I would have been collaborating in my own dehumanization. Running was an act of self-preservation, yes, but also an act of moral necessity." Isaiah's relationship with his past became more complex as he aged. The trauma of slavery did not simply fade with time or distance. He still had nightmares occasionally, dreams where he was back in the tobacco fields under the merciless sun, or in chains being dragged back to Virginia, or standing on an auction block while strangers evaluated his worth. Grace learned to recognize the signs when he woke from such dreams: the sweat on his face, the rapid breathing, the momentary disorientation as he remembered where he was and that he was free. But alongside the trauma, there was also a deep well of strength that Isaiah had developed through his experiences. He had survived slavery, had escaped against impossible odds, had built a life in freedom, had raised children who would never know bondage. These accomplishments gave him a sense of purpose and meaning that sustained him through his later years. He had not simply endured, he had overcome, and that made all the difference. In 1887, 5 years before his death, Isaiah was invited to speak at a large gathering in Toronto commemorating the 50th anniversary of Queen Victoria's accession to the throne. The organizers wanted him to speak about what freedom meant from the perspective of someone who had lived both with and without it. Isaiah accepted the invitation, recognizing it as an opportunity to share his message with a new generation. Standing before a crowd of several hundred people, black and white, Isaiah spoke without notes, drawing on memories that remained vivid despite the passage of time. He talked about the weight of chains, both physical and psychological. He described the moment when he had stood free of his bonds for the first time, the almost indescribable feeling of liberation that had coursed through him. And he talked about the folded chains, explaining what they had meant to him and what they had come to represent to others. "Freedom is not simply the absence of chains," Isaiah told the crowd, his voice carrying despite his age. "It is the presence of possibility, of choice, of the ability to shape your own destiny. When I folded those chains before leaving them behind, I was making a statement about who I was and who I intended to be. I was saying that my escape was not an accident or a moment of blind panic, but a deliberate choice made by a thinking, feeling human being. That distinction mattered then, and it matters now. We must always remember that our humanity is not granted to us by others, it is inherent in us, and no system of oppression can truly take it away unless we surrender it ourselves." The speech was received with a standing ovation, and afterwards dozens of people came up to speak with Isaiah, to shake his hand, to tell him how his story had affected them. Young black men and women told him that they drew strength from his example, that when they faced discrimination or prejudice, they thought of the folded chains and remembered that dignity could be maintained even in the face of oppression. White listeners told him that his story had opened their eyes to the reality of slavery, had helped them understand the humanity of those who had been enslaved in ways that abstract arguments never could. In his final years, Isaiah experienced the satisfaction of seeing his children and grandchildren thriving in ways that would have been impossible under slavery. His daughter Dinah became a teacher, educating children in Toronto's black community. His sons found work as craftsmen and tradesmen, respected members of their community. His grandchildren attended school, learned to read and write from their earliest years, grew up knowing freedom as their birthright rather than as a hard-won prize. Isaiah Lewis died peacefully in his sleep on the 3rd of March, 1892, with Grace holding his hand. He was 76 years old, having lived more than half his life in freedom, having seen slavery end and the beginning of a long struggle toward true equality. At his funeral, speaker after speaker rose to talk about his impact, about the example he had set, about the story of the folded chains that had inspired so many. One speaker, a young minister who had been born after slavery ended, captured something essential about Isaiah's legacy. "Brother Isaiah showed us that resistance takes many forms," the minister said. "It can be the dramatic act of escape, yes, but it can also be the small gesture that asserts dignity and humanity. Those chains, folded with care in the midst of a desperate flight, remind us that we are always more than our circumstances, that we can choose how we respond to oppression, that even in the darkest moments we have the power to make statements about who we are and what we stand for." That lesson remains vital today as we continue to fight for justice and equality. Brother Isaiah has left us, but his example remains, calling us to act with courage and intention in our own struggles. The story of Isaiah Lewis and his folded chains did not end with his death. It continued to be told and retold, adapted for new contexts and new struggles. During the Great Migration of the early 20th century, when millions of Black Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities, Isaiah's story was often invoked as an example of the courage required to leave behind the known, however oppressive, for the uncertain promise of freedom elsewhere. During the Civil Rights Movement, activists drew explicit parallels between Isaiah's act of leaving his chains folded and the strategy of nonviolent resistance. Both involved a refusal to respond to violence with violence, a commitment to maintaining dignity even in the face of brutal oppression, a belief that symbolic actions could carry profound meaning and inspire others to action. Martin Luther King Jr.'s reference to Isaiah in his 1963 sermon was not an isolated instance but part of a broader pattern of civil rights leaders finding inspiration and guidance in the stories of those who had resisted slavery. In the end, Isaiah Lewis gave us more than just an exciting tale of escape. He gave us a master class in resistance, showing us that even the smallest acts of deliberation and choice can carry profound meaning. In taking those few extra moments to fold his chains before fleeing, in refusing to simply abandon them in his panic to escape, he created a lasting symbol that has inspired countless people over the course of nearly 200 years. His story reminds us that freedom is not granted by others but claimed by individuals through acts of courage and determination. It shows us that dignity is not something that can be taken away by chains or laws or systems of oppression, but something that resides in the human spirit and can be asserted even in the most desperate circumstances. And it teaches us that sometimes the most powerful statements are the simplest ones, like a set of chains folded with care and left for others to find, a silent declaration that echoes through the centuries saying, "I was here, I was human, I made my choice, and I was free. I made